As we continue our discussion on contextualization and its meaning, I want to drive home the point on how relevant this is for all of you, regardless of your job or your ministry at this moment or in the future even. This is a map of my city. This is Houston. And if you look at these different colors, they tell you a fascinating story about this town. And so this map represents the foreign-born population by census tract. And so you can see those really dark, the kind of burnt amber, the brown, and then a few of the purple. That orange, that amber color is 30 to 40% foreign-born. The brown, the dark brown color is 40 to 65% foreign-born. And the purple color is 65 to 78% foreign-born. And so there's, a half dozen census districts in Houston where more than half the people, sometimes 3/4 of the people, are foreign born. And when you start looking at where some of these things are, if you're not from here, you don't have a good context for this. But if you see areas that are edging on 30 to 40% foreign born, way down there on the southwest side in Rosenberg, if you were to drive from Houston, you would feel as if you've left the metro area. And Rosenberg is kind of a small town outside of Houston. And so you can see just the spread of diversity, especially in the southwest quadrant and northwest quadrants. But this is something that churches have to face, that teachers have to face, that businesses have to face. The idea of learning another person's culture that's different from you is not just something for people who travel overseas or who are international business people, politicians, etc. More and more, this is becoming people like you and I. This second map is similar. This is the percentage of population in Houston, by census tract again, that speaks neither English nor Spanish as their primary language. Now, if we were to include Spanish in this, it would all turn a very dark color across the map for those higher percentages, because we have a ton of Latinos that are native Spanish speakers. But this excludes English and this excludes Spanish. And so if we start in that, oh gosh, we're going to stretch my artistic colors. If we take that middle color, that really dark pink, that's 10 to 20% that speak neither English nor Spanish. If we go one color darker to that kind of maroon color, that's 20 to 40%. And if we go all the way down to the purple, we're looking at 39 to 69%. Essentially 40 to 70% of those purple census districts speak neither English nor Spanish. So imagine being a pastor, imagine being a church planter, imagine being a counselor either at a church or a practice or a school counselor. This changes everything. Imagine being a school teacher in one of these census districts. So the need for contextualization is really, really great. I think many people don't fully comprehend why this is important and how things get mistranslated. So I want to point you to two ads that ran simultaneously. So the one is the original ad is the one on the left, which is the Pepsi ad. And it says, "We wish you a scary Halloween." And it has a Pepsi can with a Coca-Cola cape. And I suppose the message behind that is that if you took the cape off of a Coca-Cola, it's every bit as good as a Pepsi. But the same exact photograph is used, and the only thing that's changed is the slogan. And on the right-hand side is Coca-Cola's response, which says, "Everyone wants to be a hero." And in this one, the same exact can, the same everything, it communicates a completely different message. And that message is that Pepsi wants to dress up and has the aspiration to be Coca-Cola in the same way that our kids might want to be Spider-Man or Wonder Woman or Superman or whoever. And so this is the way that a particular symbol, whether that's a word that we use or an action that we use, a sign we use, a color that we use, where a symbol differs drastically from its meaning, And the meaning gets interpreted or misinterpreted based on context. I'm sure the folks at the marketing people for Pepsi felt pretty slick and were probably furious when they saw the Coca-Cola ad, which took their ad and just changed it ever so slightly. I had a friend of mine move into a neighborhood, and this was years ago before, and particularly where he was before the homosexual movement was very prominent, the LGBT movement was prominent, and he moved in this really nice, well-kept neighborhood, and everybody had these pretty little flags out in their yard, and so um, he's a dad and he's married, and they decided they'd get one of those little flags too. And then one night, the entire neighborhood showed up on their front yard and wanted to thank them for being a family who showed their support for the homosexual lifestyle. Um, Now, for him, the flag, the rainbow flag, was just a rainbow-colored flag. He thought it was a neighborhood thing. Um, but obviously, within the gay community, within the LGBT community, that has a very, very different meaning. The same exact symbol can be something completely innocuous to one person and completely charged to another. And so we really need to learn, how do we translate these symbols from one context to another. So let's jump right in, and we're going to look at something that many people call the C scale. C stands for contextualization. This was born out of Muslim ministry. However, very similar discussions have occurred throughout the world, throughout history, in terms of mission, in terms of culture. These same fights have happened within our churches over the so-called worship wars. They've happened in the church during the Cultural Revolution in the 60s and 70s. And they're going to continue happening because every generation has got to flesh out and put pen to paper on where it stands on various cultural issues. And so we look at this scale, and to start with, you have two large circles. And if you're not interested in Muslim stuff, change the right circle from Muslim identity to whatever group you see as the other. And so we start on the left-hand side with Christian identity versus Muslim identity. And then, of course, there's some overlap there in the middle. So identity is simply what you would call yourself. So for the models on the left-hand side, what you call yourself is Christian. On the right-hand side, what you call yourself is Muslim. In the middle, you come up with some sort of hybrid term, such as Messianic Muslim or completed Muslim, or Jesus-following Muslim. And so there's a number of ways that people try to balance that in the middle section, where they call themselves a follower of Jesus if they want to lean more on the Christian side. But they avoid the either term oftentimes because both have more political connotations in the area than they do theological ones, which could be argued in our own culture. The term Christian often means things that we don't intend for it to mean. For instance, my cousin is a New Ager, and in her mind, the word Christian means Southerner, gun-toting, big oil, anti-environment, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so it means very little about following Jesus and what God has done for us through Christ. It's more the political connotations of how she perceives our group, which is really ironic because a lot of Christians in the United States, and even more so throughout the world, are not Southern Republican, gun-toting, big oil, anti-environment, etc. That's actually, globally speaking, a minority. But in her mind, that's what it means to be Christian. Well, the same thing happens between any two groups. I mean, we could make this secular, and we could say Republicans versus Christians. We could put Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter. And so in each of those, once we start using big categories, when we're in one, we look at the other in terms of its more broad strokes rather than its true meaning. So we're going to start on the left-hand side at C1 and then go all the way to C6. So imagine an expat community, a group of Americans living in Saudi Arabia for work. They work at Texaco or BP or any of the big global oil companies. And of course, they're allowed to have a church while they're there. in what form will they worship while they're there? Well, in the C1 category, there's no difference, there's no comparable difference between how they would worship there in Saudi Arabia versus how they would worship here in the States. So that means they probably have a pastor that's trained at one of our seminaries. They probably have some kind of music leader that's playing hymns or Chris Tomlin or Hillsong or whatever that church is into. The language, most importantly and most obviously, will be in English, and there will be no attempt whatsoever to cross cultures and to integrate, to assimilate, to enculturate. All of this is just not even on their radar. This church is for them as outsiders. And so C1, there's no difference whatsoever. It's just as if you had picked up a church and from here and just dropped it over there. At the very opposite end of the spectrum is the C6. In many of the hardest places, there are some Christians. This category probably applies more to women because they have a lot less ability to protect themselves. But the C6 category, for them, they are completely silent. So they are followers of Jesus, but they don't share their faith. There's no attempt whatsoever to form into a Christian community or to participate in Christian community. They are completely on their own, and usually this is because of extreme persecution. So those are kind of our two outliers. So now let's look at the sort of middle zone, and this is where most of the fight takes place. So if we're starting at C1, nothing is different. So what changes by C2? Basically, a C2 church is looking at what language do the people speak. So if it's an expat community in Latin America, they go, wait a second, we're down here in Latin America. We all speak Spanish for our job, and so why don't we preach in Spanish? Why don't we worship in Spanish? That way our national friends can worship with us, and it could actually be outreach of some kind. So they take that first initial baby step to speak in the local tongue, whether it's Arabic or Spanish, Chinese, etc. But there's no other aspect, there's no other way in which they're trying to accommodate the culture. There's no change in music or dress or how women and men interact. It's simply we are taking our Western style sermon and translating it. We're taking Chris Tomlin and we're translating it. We're taking our hymns and we're translating them. There's no attempt to speak to the issues of that culture, the concerns of that culture, or speak in the forms of that culture. So if we push this one further, we wind up with a C3 church. C3 basically will adapt any neutral cultural practice. So if there's something in the culture which has no religious overtones, they are comfortable adapting this. And so this is where you start seeing things like music and clothing and those sorts of issues being assimilated into the church. Now, if you're from a holiness background, you would call this worldliness. But if you're not from a holiness background, you would call this cultural relevancy. And so they are trying to be culturally relevant. They realize not only do they have to speak the language, but they can't dress like Americans and talk like Americans and sing like Americans. You know, maybe let's pick up some of the local instruments. Let's pick up local clothing. Now, the problem as that relates to Muslim culture is if you ask Muslims, everything in their culture is Islamic. Even if it actually is or not, they at least make that assertion. They make that claim that everything is. And so it's really hard, if you ask a Muslim, to find something that's culturally neutral. The next step is anything that is not explicitly forbidden or explicitly opposed to Christ is now permissible. And so in C3, they would not use Muslim greetings. So a Muslim greeting, a very common one, is Assalamu alaikum. Assalamu alaikum means peace be upon you, which is actually a very biblical greeting. And if you're from a higher church context, that is something that people say in the service. Jesus would have spoken Aramaic, so if you look at when he walks in on his disciples through the door and they're all frightened, he says what would have sounded like in Arabic, Assalamu alaikum. but you will find many, many, many expat Christians, many national Christians who are very uncomfortable with this phrase because in their mind this is purely an Islamic greeting. So they would say something to the equivalent of "How are you?" instead of "Peace be upon you." Whereas in the C4 context, they would say, "Well, let's look at the words that are being said. The words that are being said are actually good and permissible. We're not saying some profanity. We're not declaring our allegiance to something that we can't back up, and so we'll be comfortable saying this." Now, there's a whole lot of confusion and there's lots of emotions, particularly as this relates to the Muslim world. But again, I think there's applications. You could do this intergenerationally with people in your church. You know, you've got the folks on either generation, a younger generation or older generation, that have no desire to change for the other. You know, they're C1. And then you have some that start wearing the clothes, and then you have some that really get down deep. And the more and more we do that, uh, it becomes harder and harder for the people on the less contextual side to understand. So one important shift is they are okay with things that are religiously charged but are not contrary to the Bible. And so for the name of Jesus, for instance, they would use the Muslim name for Jesus instead of the more cultural name for Jesus. Um, So there's a lot higher tolerance for linguistics and all of that to be more in this kind of middle gray area. And because of that, once we start getting on this side of that bubble, this is where a lot of the fights really start happening. But a second shift is very, very important. The second shift is if you look back in the identity, look at those big bubbles, all of a sudden we've moved out of a strict sole Christian identity and into this kind of neutral zone of where we have one foot in each world. I struggle with using the term Christian in today's culture, specifically for the story I told you about my cousin. I also struggled in using the word Christian in the Middle East because it could mean anything from George Bush supporter or Obama. It could mean what they see on MTV, what they see piped in over cable now. Um, it could mean that I was a good Christian like Britney Spears or any of the other number of Americans that they just assume are Christians. It could mean that I'm a crusader. It could simply mean I want to eat pork and drink beer and sleep around, which is how many people interpret what it means to be Christian. And so in the Muslim culture, the word Christian is very, very charged and loaded. And so the C4 category doesn't adopt a Muslim identity, but neither do they adopt a Christian identity. So they come up with some third thing, some third option. And so for me, if people asked me who I was, I would tell them that I was a monotheist, which usually just leads to more questions, which are actually the really great questions that I wanted. And so I would talk about being a monotheist, and so then they say, yeah, well, so are we, so what's the difference? Uh, or I would talk about being a follower of Jesus. Um, and so I would use kind of very neutral language that wouldn't use anything charged. The only thing that changes between C4 and C5 is the issue of identity. No longer are you in this neutral middle zone. You're now fully in the Muslim world. And so this doesn't apply. Everyone, when you start talking Muslim strategies, everyone wants to know, oh, where are you on the C scale? Well, I'm a white dude from Texas. I'm not an insider. That's the word they use for people that are C4, C5. I can't be an insider. There's only one place in the world that I'm an insider, and that's my family. Anything outside of that, I'm an outsider. Now, I'm a respectful outsider as best I can be. I try to be as culturally relevant as I can be. But in this C5 category, they would call themselves Muslim. Now, many people have written about this particular category, and they would say even within this category, there's a spectrum. There's a spectrum of people who would just use the word Muslim without any kind of modification, and there are others who would use Messianic Muslim or Jesus-following Muslim or something of that nature. And so when people simplify this as it's either this or that, and then they want to crucify you for being that, usually they don't see these nuances. But this is the C scale in its entirety, and it's a partially useful tool. The problem is the man who designed it. He recognized this as an observation of what was currently going on. And everybody who wants to fight about the issues uses it as a tool to be prescriptive rather than descriptive of what your practices are. And that's where it becomes problematic, which is why people will ask me, am I an insider? And I have to say flatly, no. And so that leads us to another helpful scale called the W scale, which has a little bit more relevancy for us as being outsiders to the Muslim culture. So this is the W scale. This comes from an article that I've posted into our Moodle, which you can read it in its entirety there. It's not required for you to read it, but you have it there for your access. We'll talk about this. And again, like the C scale, this doesn't only apply to people who work in the Muslim world. This also has a lot of application for you as you think of what is going to be your model for engaging cross-culturally. And so there are basically 4 positions along this scale, the W1 being the most conservative and least accommodating to culture, and W4 being the highest and most accommodating. And then I'll just go down these columns here on the left-hand side. We have the basic description, the worker's self-identity, the Muslim's perception of worker, view of Muhammad, use of Quran, women's dress, Ramadan fasting, prayers, view of Father of Jesus, and the God of Muhammad. And so I won't go through each and every one of these. This was in that article, so you can look at it more detailed if you like. In W1, this is the triumph model. And the basic description is that Christianity triumphs over Islam. It's a conquering model. So the worker's self-identity is not just I'm Christian, but usually gets a lot more specific. I belong to, the Baptist denomination or the Presbyterian or Anglican or the particular denomination or even sub-denomination. And how the Muslim sees the worker is the sensitive way in the Muslim world to say missionary. How they see them is that they're some kind of denominational person. If they're aware enough of what the denominations are, they might be aware of that then. The view that a W1 worker has regarding Muhammad is that they oppose Muhammad. He was false and he was evil. Their use of Quran is they would avoid it. They would see it as potentially demonically influenced or demonically sourced. And so it's completely a threat. The women who are workers in this culture would dress as they would in their home culture. So they would dress like Americans or Canadians or Europeans. Or they look at Ramadan fasting as being syncretistic and sinful. So there's no way in which they try to be culturally sensitive or participatory during Ramadan fasting. They view this as a pagan holiday, just as you might view Halloween or any other kind of holiday of that nature. And for them, they continue to pray as they would in their home or their denominational tradition. So they don't make any changes in how they pray. For Muslims, Islamic prayer is very, very physical. There's prayer positions, there's prayer directions, there's prayer times, there's particular prayers. It's what in the church we would call liturgy, less of what we would call prayer so much. But there's no attempt on the worker's part to try to do this. The workers' view of the Father of Jesus versus the God of Muhammad, they would say they're not the same. The God of Muhammad is a satanic deception. And so in their mind, Allah and God are 2 completely separate beings. So I'm going to read across that column just because I think it's instructive. So on that bottom column, from they're not the same, the W2 worker, this is an idea that Christianity replaces Islam, and so they would identify as a Christian. They wouldn't get so much into what kind of Christian they are. But if we go all the way down to the bottom, the view of the Father of Jesus and God of Muhammad, they would say they're not the same, and that Muslims are gravely misled about God. So they wouldn't take it as a satanic deception. So we see how the language and the rhetoric is kind of being scaled down. In W3, this is a transformational model. They would see the Father of Jesus and the God of Muhammad as they're sort of the same, kind of a yes but no answer. The focus is on knowing Jesus in order to know God in this paradigm. And then finally, the W4, they would say they're the same, although Jesus is the only way to truly know God, and to love him better. So they would say, look, the God of Abraham for Christians is the same as the God of Abraham for the Jews, is the same as the God of Abraham for the Muslims. Now, I'm not trying to get you to agree or disagree with any one of these positions. You're free to take any of them. And I think part of the problem on the C scale and on the W scale, as I've said in many other things where we lay out 5 different options, is that we're tempted to take one and just to exclude others. And I think that can lead us into problems. And so on particular ones of these, I'm very contextual. On other particular aspects, I'm not nearly as contextual. And so, I think there are things in every culture and every religion that legitimately fall under the W1 category, that God just triumphs over human sin. And that's just the way there is. There's no Christian version of pornography or adultery or anything of this nature. God just has to triumph. And I think there, in every religion and culture, there are things that are neutral and things that are positive. And so for me, if you say, what's your opinion on this or that, I would have to say, well, it depends on the particular topic. I don't take I'm against culture, or I'm pro-culture, or it depends. So in the W4 model, we'll just go down that one to give you the contrast between W1 and W4. This is a completion model. So biblical faith completes Muslims. So the worker's identity is, I am like a Muslim. They might say I'm submitted to God. Usually someone who's going to be this deep in has a high grasp of linguistics. They speak the local language. And I would say if you don't speak the local language, using phrases like I'm submitted to God can be very, very confusing and even misleading. If you do have the ability to explain that when there's a question, and to understand when you're not being, and to recognize when you're not being understood, this might be something for you. The Muslim sees them as some kind of monotheist or Christian or Muslim-y kind of person. They don't see them as a Muslim in maybe a theological sense. So one time I was sitting at a cafe, and I had a usual set of friends that I would go there with, and there's a new guy showed up to the group that I didn't know him. And so he starts asking the rest of the group, does Brian drink alcohol? Does Brian do this? Does Brian do that? And he's going through the list of Muslim taboos, which are actually very kind of Old Testament Jewishy, if I can create a word there. And so Muhammad, my friend, he's speaking on my behalf and says, no, Brian doesn't cheat on his wife. Brian's not here to do this and do that. The usual things that they perceive Americans are there to do. And then at some point, Muhammad just got really impatient with all the questions. And he said, look, Brian is a Muslim. He's not really a Muslim. Like, he doesn't go to the mosque, and he's not following Muhammad, but he's a Muslim. And what he meant by that was, I'm a God-fearing person. I'm an honorable person. So he perceived me as upholding the wholesome values that I would argue we share in common with Muslims. And so through this, he didn't see me as this completely other category. Because in his mind, to be a Christian means all the negative things that you can imagine. And so for him to call me a Christian would have kind of been an insult. Even though for me, being a Christian means something entirely different. So this goes back to our Coke can illustration, where it's the same exact thing. It just has 2 completely different meanings based on your point of reference. So their view of Muhammad is that they tentatively affirm that Muhammad is a kind of prophet, although not in a biblical sense. Just on a personal level, I tend to struggle with going that far. I am definitely not on the W1 side, which opposes Muhammad. Saying bad things about Muhammad is one of the fastest ways to get in trouble in the Middle East. Or even being outside the Middle East, you can still get in trouble that way. But I also don't really want to affirm him even in a sort of demi-prophet status as being prophetic in some sense. In general, if I can stay off my beliefs on Islam, and I focus on the biblical story. And most of my friends have been really accepting and letting me focus that way. And so like I said, I struggle on that particular issue. So I'm definitely not in the W1 category, but I'm also not in the W4 there. It doesn't mean that's the right position. That's just me. So W4, they would read the Quran alongside the Bible, but they would say only the Bible is authoritative. Um, Again, most of my friends weren't that. It's not that they didn't know Islam, and they would definitely identify as being Muslim. But our perception is that Muslims are this really theologically driven set of people, and the reality is that for most of them, beyond the basic practices and the cultural identity of being Muslim, there's very little else in their life that's deeply Islamic. And this gets into that problem I talked about when we have a rationalistic view of contextualization. It's very easy for us to uh, get into the mindset where we learn about what they ought to know and then we make our plans based on that, which is how I started. The problem is when we get there, they're often not that way. And so, again, I'm careful with that one as well. Uh, how women dress in W4 is they dress in the local Islamic style, including veiling if that's prevalent in the host culture. That's not a universal in the Muslim world. Veiling isn't. They observe Ramadan in the same fashion as Muslims do. And so that means they would fast during the day and then they would break fast with them at night. And they might even pray with Muslims in the mosque. This is rare that I've heard of people doing this, but there are some people that do this. Instead of saying the liturgy that Muslims say, they create their own liturgy, but they stand in the mosque and at the same times in the same form. So there's bowing and prostration and whatnot involved there. So I find this table to be much more helpful in terms of trying to determine where you are. And again, we could take those four models, so the triumph model, replacement model, transformation, and completion model, and we could see how people address our culture. And in many ways, these four models pair back to what I talked about in Niebier's 5 different ways to see culture, Christ in culture. And so, we could look at these for our own culture and say, well, there's definitely several different groups from different standpoints that want to see their view of politics or their view of Christianity triumph over what they perceive to be the cultural view. You have others that simply want to replace. You have some that are looking to be transformational, and then you have others that accept a lot of American culture and are simply trying to complete. And you can think about pastors and Christian personalities, professors even, that fall into those 4 categories. So I think there's a lot of application beyond just looking at going international or even cross religion. A lot of times we can look within our own churches and you just throw out a movie that you've watched or might want to watch in a room of Christians, and you'll get very diverse opinions on, do Christians watch that kind of movie or not? I used to be in the camp when I was growing up that was very, very anti television and media and whatnot, and I've obviously transformed a long way out of that, because usually when there's any kind of really contested movie, I tend to be one of the first ones to go watch it, just so I know what's going on and can stay in the loop. So I think this is an important model that you can adapt to your own context.